Over the past few years, I've been having my wife, more commonly known as the lady I live with, try out a bunch of different video games in order to examine how someone with little to no gaming experience engages with them. These informal experiments have given me a better understanding of some of the barriers that exist for inexperienced players and the opportunity to observe what the process of someone becoming proficient in the language of video games looks like. From these experiences, she's gone from someone who knew nothing about games to someone who knows some things about games, causing the name of this series to be less and less accurate with each additional entry. Oh well. Regardless, as the series has become more about her transition from a non-gamer to a gamer, I've been interested in having her play titles that share similarities with ones she tried early on in order to see how having more experience has changed her approach to playing them. So obviously, as soon as Tears of the Kingdom was announced, I knew I would have to run another informal experiment. Breath of the Wild was one of the earlier games she played for this series, and it was pretty much the first time where she actually felt successful while playing something. The freedom the game offers allowed her to solve problems and overcome obstacles in different ways, so even when she didn't pick up on what the game was nudging her to do, she was still able to find her own path. Where in other games she'd get frustrated when doing the thing that made the most sense to her wasn't possible, in Breath of the Wild, the vast majority of things she tried actually worked, rewarding her creative thinking and never making her feel stupid for not getting something. Tears of the Kingdom takes the base of Breath of the Wild and adds all sorts of new tools designed to increase player expression, and while I found this to be a welcome shift, I am curious as to how these additions will feel for an inexperienced player like my wife, as even though having more options increases flexibility, it also increases complexity, which may prove to be more annoying than helpful. So in order to find out, I had her play through the core of the tutorial, stopping once she got off the Great Sky Island, as I figured that'd be enough to give her a chance to engage with the majority of the primary mechanics and get a decent feel for how exploration works. Like always, I sat back as a mostly silent observer, only providing occasional reminders of things she had already learned and advice on what to do when she got stuck for a substantial amount of time. So this is how it went. Tears of the Kingdom gives control to the player quicker than any other 3D Zelda game, and this was something my wife appreciated, as she likes it when she doesn't have to spend a ton of time waiting before actually being able to start playing. This feeling was short-lived though, because the control the player is given at the start is pretty limited. Every few steps, Zelda would stop her to say something, and it got on her nerves quickly.
Am I gonna get stopped by her every time? I don't really... She's gonna stop me again. Oh my god!
These interruptions seem to be a way to characterize Zelda as an excitable nerd while also providing some information about the lore of the world, but my wife found it to be far more annoying than endearing or informative. With games in the past, she's always found being stopped in this way to be jarring, as when she's playing a game, she really just wants to play the game, and losing control out of nowhere feels kind of bad. So it happening so many times in a row left a sour taste in her mouth. After all that, things did pick up a little as she came across a brief yet thrilling fight. But then that was followed by a fairly long cutscene that was followed by another fairly long cutscene, and she wasn't all that interested in any of it. In general, the intro is filled with a ton of exposition about the Zonai and the history of Hyrule, and while I found this to be intriguing because I'm invested in Zelda lore, for her it was just a massive info dump about a world she knew next to nothing about. It just didn't mean much to her, and she ended up zoning out a bit. I've noticed this happen with cutscenes in other games she's played, but certainly not all of them. Really, her investment in a scene typically comes down to whether or not it is character focused. For instance, with The Last of Us, she was drawn in right away by Joel and Sarah's banter. The scene is about people connecting with each other, making it easy for her to care about what was going on in a way that hearing about a war that happened 10,000 years in the past never could. While there are certainly a few great moments in these early cinematic sequences in Tears of the Kingdom, they largely fail at being compelling scenes for a more general audience. What matters more though is that she went from thinking she'd get to start playing right away to sitting through 20 plus minutes of dialogue and cutscenes that she struggled to connect with, providing a decent bit of whiplash. And unfortunately, it would be a little longer until she got into the game proper, because upon arriving in the Room of Awakening and grabbing the decayed Master Sword, she spent about 5 minutes searching every corner of the room for something to help her get out. To her, the Master Sword looked too blunted and brittle to be an effective weapon, and she assumed it would break before anything she might hit it with would. And in fairness, she wasn't that far off about that, but it did lead to her drawing the wrong conclusion. She overthought what was being asked of her, causing her to ignore the most obvious approach. After not finding anything, she eventually gave the Master Sword a shot despite not thinking it would work. Throughout all of these experiments, I've noticed that my wife doesn't test things nearly as much as I do when playing a game. For her, if an action doesn't make sense, she rarely gives it a second thought. So when she got a sword that looked like it was about to fall apart, in her mind it stopped being a viable answer to the obstacle. As she's played more and more games, she's gotten better at interpreting the information presented to her, but it does still trip her up sometimes, and this was not the only instance of it happening during her playthrough of Tears of the Kingdom. The first and funniest, at least to me, happened at the very start, with her not knowing what button to press when the first text box showed up.
Can you help me? How do I follow the thing it's telling me? It's got a look down arrow.
Press A.
Why would that be the answer?
And this is pretty much exactly what happened when she played Breath of the Wild for the first time. What'd you hit to interact with it?
A. Well, okay, it had a little like triangle facing down, so I was looking for that.
In fairness, it has been years since that first experience, so I'm not surprised it didn't stick with her. Also, the majority of the time, both games show button prompts for various actions, so having the arrow is visually inconsistent with how they present most other information. Another example came up during the Fuse Shrine, where she noticed the green coloring of the locked door, the green light on the front of the chest holding the key to it, and the green light of the Zonai charge in her inventory. Because of this, she thought they all must be connected, leading to a good chunk of time being spent on her trying to get something that would never work to work.
Are you kidding me right now? Are you kidding me right now? That didn't do it?
Ultimately, there will always be visuals that are misunderstood by players, even by ones who play games all the time. And while I do think developers should always consider the many ways the information they put out there may be interpreted, there is no way to control for how every player's brain will process information. That's why one of the best lessons an inexperienced player can learn is to just test everything, even if it doesn't make as much sense to them as the idea they originally started focusing on. Frankly, even I should do this more. Anyway, bringing it back to how things started, once she figured out that the Master Sword wasn't completely useless, she made her way through the next bit easily enough, and after a brief freak out about how high up she was,
that seems like a death trap.
She made the leap into what I would say is the true start of the game. All things considered, it took her about 30 minutes to get to a spot where things actually opened up, and around 2/3 of that time was filled with text boxes and cutscenes. By comparison, it took her just 10 minutes to get to Breath of the Wild's title reveal and into the core of the tutorial, giving her the chance to immediately get a feel for the gameplay and what was expected of her. The frequent stops and starts of Tears of the Kingdom's opening sequence is a sharp contrast to this near immediate freedom, and it definitely left her feeling less engaged and a little frustrated. Having a hot start can go a long way for both experienced and inexperienced players. As games are an interactive medium, gameplay is the best way to connect someone to what's going on, so the sooner the player can get to that, the better, especially when they have no connection to the source material. It's also tough when a title relies so heavily on cinematics, despite them not being an important part of what the game is trying to do. Tears of the Kingdom's slower intro set up a rocky start for her, and while things did get smoother once she made it into the game proper, the design of the Great Sky Island proved to be a challenge for her in ways that the Great Plateau of Breath of the Wild did not. When it comes to games that center around player freedom, there generally are a ton of mechanics and ideas to figure out, and finding the best way to introduce those elements without getting in the way of the player's freedom is a tough challenge for developers. It's almost impossible to get perfect, and Tears of the Kingdom is no exception. The major mechanics are largely presented in one of three ways: by either pausing the action to show a text box of how something works, having a small informational prompt pop up in the top right corner of the screen, or being told how to do something by an NPC. I've talked a bit in the past about some issues with the first two approaches, primarily that pausing runs the risk of annoying the player, and that small text in the corner of a screen can be easily missed. Games that do these things would probably be better off finding some sort of middle ground between the two, that doesn't completely stop the action, but does put information front and center. While my wife didn't love either of those two approaches in Tears of the Kingdom, the third one is what ended up having a far more consequential effect on her playthrough. The Great Sky Island is filled with constructs, and many provide useful information about anything from combat to cooking. It's a cool way to incorporate tutorials somewhat organically, but it doesn't come without issues. The first being that the Great Sky Island is massive, and it's unlikely that players will comb every inch of it. Given that some of the constructs are pretty tucked away, it makes it very likely that the player will miss important information. What ended up being the biggest reason my wife didn't engage with the constructs though, is that they are the primary enemy type on the island, and as she encountered a hostile one before a helpful one, she became wary of all of them. In general, she struggled with combat, and because she couldn't tell which kind of construct was which from a distance, it felt safer for her to just avoid them whenever possible. Eventually though, she did get better at figuring out which ones were friendly. She noticed that intense music would play around the ones that attacked her, so as long as she didn't hear anything, she knew she was safe. By that point though, she had already passed important information that would have been helpful to know. For instance, in order to get the Ascend ability, the player has to deal with the brutal cold of the snowy region, and the most efficient way to do that is by cooking a meal with spicy ingredients. There is a construct near the entryway of that area that tells this to the player, but doesn't actually explain how to cook. The ones that do are on a different part of the island, and she missed both of them, leaving her to figure it out on her own. Obviously, it's not the most complex thing in the world, and is something a lot of players will remember from Breath of the Wild, but as she had only done it once before years ago, she didn't know what the game wanted from her. She tried sitting by the fire to see if an option to cook would pop up, which frankly probably is how it should be done, but I do get why Nintendo likes it to be a more manual thing. I ended up having to nudge her in the right direction, and she mostly was confused as to why the construct by the fire didn't just tell her how it worked. In Nintendo's effort to have these mechanics be taught in a natural way, it makes it possible for them to not be taught at all. In fairness, Tears of the Kingdom does have a wild amount of mechanics. It's why there is so much player freedom, and it can be hard to communicate all that information without overwhelming the player. I imagine the reason some aspects aren't presented as plainly as others is so that the player doesn't get bombarded with too many concepts. Now, having cooking fall into that category doesn't make much sense to me, but the general approach does. With that said, even with there being fewer mandatory tutorials than there could have been, my wife still got overwhelmed quickly from the sheer amount of inputs she needed to learn.
There's too many buttons for this. I'm never gonna know this. I won't. I won't.
Due to all the things Link can do in Tears of the Kingdom, the controller is pretty much used up to its limit. There aren't really any wasted buttons, and on top of that, there are also a bunch of conditional inputs based on what ability you're using, where you're standing, or if you're in the air. Honestly, keeping track of the controls is something I had troubles with. Even after a dozen hours of playing, I still would press the wrong thing when trying to switch abilities, so it's no surprise that being inundated with all this information would be even more stressful for a less experienced player. As new mechanics were introduced to her, instead of integrating them into her approach, she mostly just relied more on the ones she felt comfortable and familiar with, so that largely boiled down to doing the stuff she remembered from Breath of the Wild, and by that I mean climbing. And it did serve her well for a while, but unfortunately, climbing couldn't get her out of every situation.
This doesn't make it. Oh god, okay. How do I get up there then? How do I do it? How do I do it? Can you help me? I don't have a lot of time.
How might you be able to do it?
How might I be able to do it? That's a great question.
Of the mechanics exclusive to Tears of the Kingdom, she was most drawn to Ultra Hand, which I imagine is fairly common. It is wildly versatile, and many obstacles across the world are designed with it in mind. In fact, when watching her play, it became clear just how much of the tutorial is centered around teaching the ins and outs of Ultra Hand. As it has so many elements to it, showing the different use cases to players has a ton of value, and will make their transition into the game proper sharper, much smoother. However, this ends up having a significant impact on the design of the Great Sky Island, in that in order to properly teach the wider scope of the mechanic, the player is heavily guided down a certain path. After reaching the Temple of Time, which is the first objective, they are pointed directly at the Ultra Hand Shrine that is conveniently located right next to it. Once that is completed, the player is encouraged to mark the other two shrines, the Ascend Shrine, which is up in the mountains and super far away, and the Fuse Shrine, which is somewhat close and the trek looks simple enough, making it more likely to go that way. Also, there are paths on both sides of the Ultra Hand Shrine that lead toward the Fuse Shrine, increasing the odds even further that players will head to it. This is the path my wife took, it's the path I took, and it's the path most people I know who've played the game took. Most importantly, it is the path Nintendo clearly wants the player to take, and they aren't subtle about it. This is a pretty big departure from the structure of Breath of the Wild's tutorial, because once the player starts down the path, they kind of get locked into a linear progression around the Great Sky Island. There are massive gaps between its different sections, so players can't really change course unless they completely backtrack. Comparatively, while Breath of the Wild also has an intended route, it feels far more like a suggestion, as given the layout of the Great Plateau, players can easily head to any shrine they want to at any point. They never really get locked into just one path. This is something my wife really liked, as it allowed for a more fluid approach to the various challenges she encountered. When she came across an obstacle that seemed too much for her, she'd just go somewhere else and take on a challenge she felt more ready for. With Tears of the Kingdom though, she ran into various spots that acted almost like choke points, where she had to engage with an obstacle in a specific way in order to progress. These bottlenecks act as a way to almost guarantee that the player will learn more about the complexities of the major abilities before being unleashed into the wider world. The goal is to provide more situational practice, and it makes sense from a game design standpoint, but it does go against the open design philosophy of Breath of the Wild's tutorial, and honestly of the rest of Tears of the Kingdom. This created a bit of friction for my wife, as she didn't feel like she was able to forge her own path, and instead had to troubleshoot specific challenges until she got it.
Oh god. Help me! Get Dash! Thanks. No! No! No!
On top of that, the Great Sky Island being made up of a bunch of smaller islands that aren't always the easiest to traverse didn't help her either. Going the wrong way felt way more consequential, because getting back on track was rarely as simple as walking back to where she last was like she could in Breath of the Wild. Instead, it became a new obstacle to overcome, in her eyes mostly serving as a way to eat up a bunch of time just to get back to square one. Of course, these diversions did get her to better understand stamina management and the range of Ultra Hand, but she didn't find it satisfying to put in so much effort without any notable sense of progression. Most side paths ended up feeling like dead ends to her, and frankly, a lot of them are. They may give an item or bypass a small part of the main path, but ultimately they are just detours. To be clear, Tears of the Kingdom's tutorial does have a kind of navigational freedom. It's unlikely that two players will walk the exact same path within the intended route, and even the bottlenecks can be done without engaging with whatever it is trying to get the player to engage with. It is also possible to complete the shrines in any order, although doing the Fuse Shrine first involves running directly past one of the other two, so it's unlikely someone would do this for any reason other than to get footage for a YouTube video where they mention it can be done. Despite all that, the navigational freedom given to players in the tutorial is still limited, which made it harder for her to play how she wanted to. Where in Breath of the Wild's tutorial, freedom is used to give players choices, in Tears of the Kingdom, freedom seems to be there so players feel like they have choices, even though the game is doing everything it can to funnel them down one path. While this certainly wasn't the biggest issue for her, she did get hung up on obstacles in a way she didn't really in Breath of the Wild. Interestingly enough, had she gone the other way around the island, it would have been a far easier time, as it mostly involves climbing up and then down. It doesn't require solving any Ultra Hand puzzles and is pretty much just a straight shot from one shrine to the next. Even a lot of that can be skipped by going to the slope near the Ascend Shrine and using a plane to glide over to the Fuse Shrine, although I don't think my wife would have thought to do that, and even if she had, she didn't have the best track record with controlling the planes.
What's happening? What's happening? What's happening? Oh! Dive, R. I don't know if there's water beneath me. What happened?
All in all, even though that path would have been simpler, I think it's for the best that she didn't take it, as gaining a better understanding of the mechanics is more important than getting through things with no resistance. Going the unintended way means missing out on learning the intricacies of a bunch of mechanics, and it's a bit surprising to me that it's an option at all because of how ineffective of a tutorial it ends up being. With that said, it could be argued that this path teaches the most valuable lesson of Tears of the Kingdom, which is that there are many ways to break the intended experience, and the player should never be afraid to do it. While my wife didn't learn that lesson in this way, it is one she came around to in her own time. Even though the main abilities in Tears of the Kingdom are more mechanically complex than the ones in Breath of the Wild and therefore harder to learn, my wife ended up liking them all way more, especially, as I mentioned before, Ultra Hand. This is not surprising, as the games she's enjoyed the most throughout these experiments typically include building in some capacity. In general, she finds it fun to create stuff, and it also gives her a sense of control that makes it easier for her to feel invested. When she can manipulate items or even the environment itself, it gives her more opportunities to do things in a way that makes sense to her, instead of having to fully conform to what a game wants her to do. This type of sandbox approach allows her real-world logic to be more effective within the game space. Of course, the actual process of using Ultra Hand did take her a while to get used to. Getting objects rotated in the direction she wanted involved a lot of trial and error, and due to all the conditional controls, she'd sometimes mistake what mode she was in and move things in ways she didn't mean to. In turn, this sometimes led to her attaching things in suboptimal ways, and she often found herself wishing that the game just knew what she wanted to do.
You're kidding me? I have to do it perfectly?
Well, it doesn't know how you want it.
Well, it should.
Why?
It's so obvious. Don't you write about me like that. Don't you dare.
While a change like this would make the building in Tears of the Kingdom less versatile and interesting, given that most of the things she constructed were relatively straightforward, I do understand her desire for it to autocorrect to a position that actually makes sense. It being so particular with how attaching objects together works led to her spending a lot of time trying to get things just right. And as in her everyday life she's a bit of a perfectionist, she always wanted things to be aligned as perfectly as possible, which added even more time. All of this did give her a ton of practice though, and she started to get a pretty good grasp over how it worked. And due to it being a mechanic she enjoyed, she didn't mind the time it took to figure it out. The other ability she got a decent bit of use out of was Ascent. She liked being able to get to the top of things quickly, especially as she was prone to falling off stuff. As for the other two, she barely engaged with either, pretty much only ever using them when it was mandatory. In fact, she actually skipped past a few puzzles that I thought required them. The first happened in the Fuse Shrine with the puzzle I mentioned before, where she hyper-focused on the green of the chest matching the green of the construct core instead of looking at the wood plank and leaves surrounding the chest. By the time she started to search for a different solution, the fire fruits she had picked up earlier were a distant memory, so instead of using Fuse, she found a torch, placed an arrow in it, and shot it up there.
I did it! It's not what I thought was gonna happen though.
Her goal was to burn the chest, but even though the plan was off by a bit, it still worked, which is all that matters. The next major instance was just before the Forest Shrine. To get to it, the player has to fast travel to the starting room and then use recall to traverse these gears. But when she got to the room, she ran right past them towards the waypoint on her minimap. At first, she looked around to see if there was a way to climb up, but then remembered that she could use Ascend, which got her right into the room.
I wanted to do that all the way.
That's interesting. The last notable instance happened in the fourth shrine itself. It ends with a puzzle where the player has to use recall to align the hands on the clock in order to open the door, but instead she used Ultra Hand to get them aligned and then attach them together.
Wow, I'm so good!
All of these were really awesome to see because they aren't how I did them or would have thought to do them. With all 3 instances, it seems pretty clear that Nintendo designed them with these approaches in mind. While the devs definitely heavily guide the player throughout the tutorial, their goal still is to get them to be as creative as possible with the tools they have, and creating challenges that can be solved through the use of different abilities is one way to get players to do that, and it certainly worked for my wife. It just took being pushed to learn the ins and outs of the major mechanics. Even though it took longer to get there, she was eventually able to have a similar sense of freedom with Tears of the Kingdom that she had with Breath of the Wild. I'd even argue that in some ways it was a more meaningful form of freedom, as most of the freedom she felt in Breath of the Wild came from being able to find her own path to a destination, which had more to do with the world layout and ability to climb almost anything than having a solid understanding of the core mechanics. Here though, the freedom came through clever uses of the core abilities. She was able to apply what she had learned earlier in order to progress, even when it was not the intended or optimal approach, and this made her feel good at the game in a way that not even Breath of the Wild did. All things said and done, Tears of the Kingdom proved to be a much more challenging game for her than its predecessor. For the majority of the time, she felt limited with how she could approach each obstacle and confused by the complexity of the various abilities. But by the end, it did successfully get her to a place where she understood the mechanics well enough to use them in a way that made the most sense to her. And that's the beauty of Tears of the Kingdom's approach to game design. It gives players the tools to do things in a way that makes the most sense to them. There are almost always multiple solutions to a problem, and I'm sure Nintendo planned for many of them, but the mechanics are so versatile that players have found ways to do things that Nintendo could have never fully anticipated. Now, I don't think every game should do this. I love when a title pushes me to think in the way it wants me to, but it is incredibly liberating to play a game that gives players this much agency, and I think titles that do this are especially valuable for less experienced players. Not having to conform to a single approach lowers the barrier of entry. The hard part is getting those players to a point where they have a grasp over the many things there are to learn, and I don't think Tears of the Kingdom fully nails it with how it onboards newcomers. In some instances, it leaves far too much up to chance, and in others, it directs the player in a way that almost feels at odds with the game's ethos. With that said, it did do just enough to prepare my wife to engage with it in the way it was meant to be engaged with, by learning to break the quote-unquote rules. Tears of the Kingdom is far too massive and combat focused for my wife to be interested in playing a whole lot more of it, but the mechanical freedom it offered did help build her confidence as a player. She gained an understanding of the game that felt unique to her. Like Breath of the Wild, it met her in the middle in a way most games haven't. And I think titles that do this are some of the best for turning non-gamers into gamers.
You proud of me?
Yeah, it's very good.
That was really good.
You're very good.
That was extra good. Do you want to do another one?
As my wife has now played through the first hour or so of a bunch of different games, I figured it was about time to check in with her to see which ones she's actually enjoyed playing. So I had her make a list of her favorites for us to go over, and you can watch us talking about them right now on Nebula. For those of you who don't know, Nebula is a creator-owned streaming service that I've been a part of for 3 years now, and over there you can watch everything I post on YouTube ad-free, as well as a ton of exclusive videos. This past year alone, I made a video essay diving into the ending of BioShock Infinite, did a ranking of modern Soulsborne games, turned a script I wrote 10 years ago into an unfortunate video, and a bunch of other stuff. Nebula gives me a place to experiment with content, like interviewing my wife about what games she likes to play, and it's also one of the best ways to support me as a creator, because when you sign up for Nebula using my link in the description, I get a chunk of that money for as long as you're subscribed. By signing up, you can get access to everything on Nebula, which ranges from original series to podcasts, to classes, to anything else that some of the best creators on the platform are interested in making, like Patrick H. Willems' Star Wars Holiday Special. Also, Nebula is currently offering lifetime plans, so for a one-time payment you can get access to the service for as long as you and Nebula are both on this earth. If you're not looking to make a big purchase though, you can still get Nebula for $2.50 a month for a year over at nebula.tv/rasbuten. Regardless of the plan you choose, Nebula is one of the best places on the internet for high-quality entertainment, and it is a great deal. So yeah, give it a look, help support me, and watch my wife talk about how she likes Fortnite. Anyway, thanks to Nebula for sponsoring this video. For all of you still watching, hello. I'd like to thank my patrons for making this channel possible and give a special shout out to Victor DUva for being an honorary bagbuten. I hope you all have a great day and or night, and I'll see you in the next one.
I want to be done. Take it.
You kept playing.
I'm done.
Good job.